Hi, I'm Jim Dooley, and welcome to the 15 questions for the fans on Reddit for the TV show Pushing Daisies. Let's go. Question 1. Who was your favorite character to write for? My favorite character to write for was Emerson Codd. I loved writing all that crime jazz for him. Funny story, when I first started putting the sounds together for the show, I needed finger snaps. So I asked my assistant at the time to record some finger snaps, not knowing that he was incapable of snapping his fingers. So, the finger snaps that you hear on the soundtrack are my own. Question 2. What was the creative process to make sure the plot, scenery, and music matches as well as it did? Well, the easy answer to that is Bryan Fuller. Everything about what we were all doing was Bryan Fuller's vision for the show, well, as well as working with Barry Sonnenfeld, the director of the pilot. So everything that we had to do was based on the color schemes, the ideas, the textures, and even the temp music choices of Bryan and Barry. But that is how we put everything together. You follow your wonderful leader, Bryan Fuller. Question 3. What is your favorite piece from the show? Well, I can say this. My favorite theme from the show is the love theme for Chuck and Ned. That was not an easy piece to write, and it needed to be something that could be tied into the fairy tale part from the beginning of the pilot, and also then tie into their love for the rest of the series. So it had to have a childlike quality to it, but at the same time have enough feeling and love in it to go the distance for the rest of the seasons. Question 4. There were more vocals in the second season. Was that your decision? No, that was not my decision. However, I can tell you a story about how some of the songs made it into the show. Before season 2, Kristin Chenoweth recorded a CD of songs that she believed Olive Snook, her character, would sing in the series. I was given one of these to work on. It was Eternal Flame. And I remember talking to Kristin about this. I said, wow, the piano player that you have in the background, like this guy or girl is amazing. I think they're really going to go someplace. And she says, of course, who could it be? Marvin Hamlish. Question 5. What was your process for working with Kristin Chenoweth and Ellen Greene on cover songs? Well, this was a fantastic process, and I can tell you one interesting story about this. When we were putting the album together, we hadn't finished the album-length versions of the songs for that. So we had to get everybody back in a room and get them to record their parts. However, Kristin was in New York practicing for the Thanksgiving Day parade. So I went to New York to record her singing Hopelessly Devoted, the album version. I remember this because I brought my parents along, and we recorded it in the Brill Building, the famous Brill Building where Carole King and Neil Diamond and so many famous songwriters worked and created so many hit songs. We worked that day, finished it off, and got it ready for the record. Question 6. I saw that you used custom instruments on a series of unfortunate events. Did you use any in Pushing Daisies? Yes, I created many custom instruments for Pushing Daisies. The finger snaps, as I said before, I personally created. As well, when we did the episode The Legend of Myrtle McQuatty, Bryan Fuller said that he wanted jug band horror. And so I had to create jug samples. And what I mean by that is when you take a big jug and blow across the top, just the way you would with like a glass soda bottle or something, that sound, so that ties into the plot of the show. So we sat around and made all of these samples blowing into these jugs so that I could play them on the keyboard and then add them to the soundtrack. Question 7. How did you develop specific characters' themes? For example, Olive's sad sexy sax. From the very beginning, Bryan Fuller asked me to associate each unique theme for the characters with a unique corresponding instrument. And so we have a saxophone for Olive Snook. Emerson Codd is always going to be the upright bass and the finger snaps. So when these two characters are in a scene together, that is the only instruments that you're going to hear. What made it most difficult is that when we did an episode like Dim Sum Lose Some, that has a skin, as I would call it, on top of doing a John Carpenter Big Trouble in Little China. So if you were to have these instruments and then that overlay, that skin, that meant that that piece of music could only be used in that scene and not cut from one episode to the next. That meant that every piece of music in each episode had to be custom written. Question 8. The main theme for Pushing Daisies is one of the most beautiful and memorable soundtrack pieces I've ever heard. and it fits the show perfectly. How did you come up with it? Was it the first thing that you wrote for the show? It wasn't the first thing I wrote, but it definitely was very early on in the pilot. I was getting emails and calls from Bryan Fuller and Barry Sonnenfeld about the order of the scenes they wanted me to tackle in the pilot. One of the earliest scenes was Hands Against the Wall. This is when Chuck and Ned are putting their hands against a wall on different rooms that they're not touching. And this is where the love theme first comes into play. It was very tricky to come up with something, as I said earlier, that was going to be this fairy tale part from the very beginning of the pilot that would also translate into their love for the entire series. Question 9. Were there any outside musical inspirations when writing for the show? Yes, there were many outside influences for the music for the show. I remember when I first got to the pilot, there was some temp from Philip Glass, there was some French music, there was some crime jazz, and then my job became taking all these disparate influences and making them one cohesive whole, and that made that a very challenging score. Question 10. What was the creative process like working with others on the show? How collaborative was it? Pushing Daisies was one of the most collaborative jobs that I've ever had. What we would do is sit in a room together with the editor, the writers, Bryan Fuller, our producers, all look at each episode, and whoever came up with the best idea, that's what we would go with. In the season 2 liner notes to the soundtrack, I remember I called this my promise session, which I would say to Bryan, of course, let's combine John Carpenter and French music and crime jazz, and we'll put vocals like the Andrews Sisters and putting these all together. Sure, I can do that. And then I would go back to my studio and get just absolutely frightened if I could actually pull this thing off. However, we all got in the rooms together for every episode and talked it through, and the best idea would always win. Question 11. What was the hardest piece of music to write in the whole series? The hardest part in the whole series was the sword fight. Now, I can't recall exactly which episode that was, but I remember this sword fight went on forever. I think it was 5 minutes long, and I usually have to write 8 minutes in a day to get the series done on schedule. And this one, I could only do 5, which actually put me back about half of a day of writing. It was so involved, there were so many references, and it was so busy, and everything had to be hit like animation style, and that was the hardest thing that I had to write in the entire series. Question 12. How much music did you have to write for each episode? How much time for each episode? Now, this is really the biggest challenge that I had on Pushing Daisies, was getting the show done on time. Now, in each episode of the show, there's between 42 and 44 minutes of music. Now, let's do some math. I can write 30 seconds of that style of music every hour, and that means I have to do 8 minutes per day. And so, that means I have a 16-hour writing day, not commute day, just sitting in the chair writing, 6 days a week. Because on the 7th day, I wasn't resting. I was watching the following week's episode in the morning and then conducting the previous week's episode at night with the orchestra. So, 6 days a week, 16 hours a day for 2 years. Very challenging, but obviously very much worth it. Question 13. Did you record live instrumentation for each episode? If so, what? Yes. We recorded live orchestra for nearly every episode in the series. It was a 16-piece string section, 8 violin, 4 viola, and 4 cello. We did most of these sessions at Henson Studios in Hollywood, the former studios of Charlie Chaplin, and on the stage where the famous song, We Are the World, was recorded. Question 14. Each episode has a unique sound to it. How was that accomplished? Whose idea was it? Each episode in the series is paying an homage to another style of movie. Like, for example, Dim Sum Lose Some is done in the style of Big Trouble in Little China. And so my score is going to reflect the ideas, the aesthetics, and the score of the movie that we're referencing. For example, when you see Olive Snook and she's dressed as her nun habit, like The Sound of Music, then I'm going to be writing something in that style. And each of these episodes were written with a new style in mind, and then my job to take some of that style, bridge it with the Pushing Daisy style, and put them together. Question 15. There have been rumors about a Pushing Daisies musical. Care to comment? I have also heard about these rumors. All I can say is there are no plans that I know of right now, but for anyone making the musical,